Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025, episode 369, and we're going to talk about strong opinions held loosely and Tecumseh's War, what we can learn from that war. I was listening to Ron Paul's Liberty Report today, and he had a guest, Nico Perrino, who currently works for FIRE. But in a previous life, like 12 years ago, back in 2011, he helped Ron Paul in his 2012 bid for president. And he was in charge of the Students for Liberty. I believe that's what it's called. SFL, yes, Students for Liberty movement at his campus. It was somewhere in the Midwest. And from there, he, I guess, studied law and now is working with FIRE, freedom, eh, uh, individual rights and education, right? So basically, it's a free speech organization. I'm pretty sure I got that right. Uh, and it's based out in Philadelphia. I had reached out to Fire actually when my contract wasn't renewed, but by that time, not getting renewed primarily because of your politics or religion even is sort of passé, and so they took a hard pass on my case and encouraged me to um, pursue the case with union lawyers, which I'm currently doing now. Okay, so in that interview that he had, he was discussing some of the things that he and Fire were working on at the time, and he used an expression, strong opinions held loosely. And I thought that was a really good little expression, strong opinions held loosely, because that pretty much epitomizes what I usually say to people when it comes to sharing opinions. I Googled it, and apparently the origin is unknown. It seems that a lot of people went and looked for similar expressions throughout history in various how shall I say, subjectivities, like in the business subjectivity, philosophy, and whatnot. But yes, so it's been around, and I guess it's kind of an obvious observation or position to hold when it comes to opinions. But in my process of Googling, I saw that there were different reactions to that expression. And a lot of it was a kind of criticism. And it doesn't surprise me primarily because everyone has a different take, because everyone's subjectivity is going to be at least slightly different from everybody else. And so you will read an expression that has four words, strong opinions held loosely, but depending on who you are and your own personal experiences, how you're going to understand that and respond to that or react to it, it's going to depend on your subjectivity. So, a couple of examples of reactions that I saw, just searching for strong opinions held loosely, and I typed in origin in there. I got strong opinions weakly held, strong opinions gently held, strong opinions strongly held, right? And that's just a little smidgen of uh, a small taste of some of the things that were floating around there in the interweb. But it's the idea that if you have an opinion that you're willing to voice, then I would argue that that's kind of a strong opinion, right? That's why you're voicing it. Otherwise, you would say, well, I've heard people say, or you'll just say, look, I really don't know much about it, so I'm not really willing to say anything. So if you are going to voice your opinion about a certain issue or a certain topic or a certain matter, then to some extent, it's a strongly held opinion, right? So in other words, the person you're talking to, it's the challenge to them to persuade you otherwise, right? And so if you're asking someone to persuade you otherwise, it's a strong opinion. Not too many Americans will plead ignorance. You pretty much go to any student and you ask them a question about a topic they know nothing about. They will have an opinion, right? And that is because people in America are trained to do that. We're socialized to do this. Whether it's we're faking that we did our reading assignment, and so you're going to make something up based on the title, what you think the title is trying to convey, or the topic, or what other people have said already, then you're going to have an opinion, right? Whether it's an educated opinion or not really doesn't seem to matter anymore. It's your opinion, right? And you're going to make sure that people know what that opinion is. Now, the idea of um, a strong opinion held loosely is that if you find a better idea or a better option or better information, then the wise person will adopt the better idea or incorporate the better information. In fact, most of us do this every day, all of the time, right? So if someone says, "Hey, let's try this restaurant," and you're like, "Well, I always eat at Maggio's, whatever." And the person you're with says, "Let's try this restaurant instead." And you're like, "Okay, fine, for you, I'll try it." And you order your typical order and it tastes better, then you'll say, "Hey, I think I found my new favorite restaurant," right? And so we had a strong opinion, but then when we were exposed to something that was better, then we change our mind. We're not going to say, well, most people do not say all things, everything else being equal, right? The price, the distance to travel, service, all things being equal, if it tastes better, then you found a new favorite restaurant, right? Uh, and so the wise person will adapt and incorporate the better idea or the better information. And that's what I mean. We do this every day. Here's a better TV show. Here's a better movie. Sit like this. It'll make you feel better. Read like this. Study like this, right? And so people are constantly bombarding us with suggestions of better ideas. And depending on who you are and what that idea is and how you feel about those ideas and your preference, well, you're going to make the choices as you see fit. And one of the things that I used to always uh, talk about to bring out the fact that all of us are going to make choices subjectively is the type of car that we drive. There are not that many car companies, there are not that many car models, and the options packages are not really that extensive. Yet, try to walk around campus, right? I would challenge the students. I would say, walk around campus and try to find two identical cars, right? Same make, model, and options package, and get back to me. And if anyone could find two cars exactly the same, then I would take them out to dinner at a restaurant of their choice, which would, and so students, their eyes would light up. And I said, no one has ever collected because it's impossible to do so, right? That in fact, it might seem like there are a limited number of options, but the fact that each person has a certain kind of preference, that all of those things in combination, it's nearly impossible to find two identical cars with two different owners, right? And one year, I'll just as a yeah, I think I'll have time to do that. One student sent me a picture of two identical cars in the parking garage. And I said to myself, "Oh no, I have to take this guy out to dinner." But then I looked closely and I saw that the license plates were sequential, right? And it means that someone who has a fleet of cars bought all of the same cars, right, with the same option package with the same color. And so I said that doesn't count because it's the same owner. And of course they're going to buy the same exact car, right? And so I got out of it that way, found a loophole. But that's the idea that unless it's a person who's buying a fleet of cars or several cars, they're all going to be different. And so when it comes to belief, then people go nuts, right? A strong opinion about something they firmly believe, people will go absolutely bonkers defending that idea. And so these are opinions that are strongly held. And this is a stubborn person. Someone who values winning an argument over finding something better, innovation. These are unwise people. Now, I'll put a caveat in there and saying that if you have religious beliefs, right, you may stubbornly, like personally, I have strong religious beliefs, but I don't impose them on other people. I will stubbornly hold those beliefs. However, it's the interpretation of what I am saying is the object of my belief that is subject to change, right? So even within that structure where I have strongly held opinions or beliefs, we'll say, I am always open to better interpretation, right? And so it all depends. There are many different ways of breaking this down, but someone who doesn't really know too much about about a situation has an opinion and will fight tooth and nail to defend that opinion. Well, that's a person who's really stubborn, and that person is unwise. More often than not, you'll find that people who position themselves in this way, they are willfully ignorant, right? They'll ignore, discount, or argue away other people's opinions primarily because they are unwilling to change. These are dangerous and undesirable people. Unfortunately, there are too many of them in society today where they refuse to acknowledge or recognize that there is a better position, there is a better interpretation, and not just be alone in their belief. Like if they were alone in their belief, then no one else would care. But the reality is that they try to have their morality legislated. They try to force everyone else to agree, uh, and therefore have to follow uh, and live a life according to their beliefs, not an individual's desire. And unfortunately, as the discussion was going on the Ron Paul podcast, you have people like this in both political parties here in the United States. And this is where hypocrisy becomes a problem for society as a whole, right? So Republicans are in power. They're doing things that upset Democrats and even step all over Democrats, right? Doing things which a lot of Democrats perceive as being wrong. However, when the Democrats come to power, they do the same thing, except their target are the Republicans, right? And so it goes back and forth. When they're in power, all of a sudden, all of the things that they complained about were they're okay now, right? And so this is hypocrisy, especially when it comes to freedom of speech. We saw it during the lockdowns, even people expressing that they like Donald Trump. This was something that was heavily censored. People are still living in that universe. But now that the Republicans are in power, it's this whole anti-Semitism nonsense, right? I think I've said before that today's claim of or accusation of anti-Semitism is basically the left's version of racist, right? And so now you're throwing this word around as if it has this broad understanding, when in fact it's no, you can't apply it to lots of different things, right? So when you see Jews who are anti-war, are you really going to call them anti-Semites? Especially the Hasidic Jews who are not really down with all of this violence and war. And so this back and forth, censoring each other is straight up hypocrisy. So, in other words, strongly held opinions lead to hypocrisy, right? Unless one believes in free speech, in which case you hold your opinions strongly, but you allow other people to have their opinions too. But generally, when you are a person who has strong opinions and you're going to hold on to them strongly, even, stepping on other people's right to free speech, that's hypocrisy. Uh, so very much we can see that the freedom of speech is very, very important. Ron Paul has frequently said, you don't have freedom of speech so you can talk about the weather. You have freedom of speech, so you can criticize the people in power, the people in government. Okay. The second topic of the day is Tecumseh's War. Now, Tecumseh was a Native American. He was a Shawnee chief in the Indiana Territory, and he led a confederacy of disgruntled Native Americans against, the early America, right? So 1811 to 1813, this was soon after the Revolutionary War and after, the ratification of, Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And now you have this conflict between Native Americans and the newly formed United States of America in the Indiana Territory. Now, the war, so Tecumseh's War started in 1811 and ended in 1813 when Tecumseh died in the battle. But it also stretches over the War of 1812, right? And so this is kind of significant, right? So Tecumseh dies in the Battle of Moravian Town in Canada, okay? But the most famous aspect of the Tecumseh War was the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 against William Henry Harrison, who became president of the United States later on. And because of his so-called quote unquote victory at Tippecanoe, he was given the name Tippecanoe, Old Tippecanoe, and his vice president pick was John Tyler. And so their campaign slogan, you might remember from back in the day when you were in school, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That was their campaign slogan. I remember learning it, I don't know, in high school at some time, and I still remembered it. I had no idea of what it was talking about, but I did remember that. Now, William Harrison died in office 1 month after becoming president, and that's because he didn't take care of himself, and so he got pneumonia, and then he died. But coming back to Tecumseh's War after the battle, so just to give a little bit of background, not all Native Americans joined the Confederacy, but it was those Native Americans who rejected, um, you know, adapting culturally with the growing United States, right? And so these are traditionalists. So Tecumseh was a traditionalist. He wanted people, Native Americans, to go back to the old ways, reject all the cultural offerings of the Europeans and live like they used to live before the Europeans ever came, which is not going to happen, right? And so most or many Native Americans were like, no, we're not going to join this Confederacy. So Tecumseh did mobilize a lot of Native Americans to rebel against treaties that were signed by Native Americans who favored cultural adaptation and accommodation with the new United States. And so people realized that if Tecumseh wasn't the Tecumseh problem, right? The rising popularity of Tecumseh wasn't addressed quickly, that they might have a really big problem. So Harrison was ordered to take 1,000 soldiers up into where Tecumseh was and preemptively attack him, right? Pretend you're there for negotiations, but really, if negotiations don't go well, then you're just going to attack them. And the battle takes place at Tippecanoe, and so they were encamped. The Harrison was encamped around Tippecanoe when Tecumseh attacks him because they realized that he was basically that Harrison was there to attack them, and so when he settles down at Tippecanoe, they attack him. Tecumseh attacks him, uh, and it really wasn't that big. 500 Native Americans attacked the 1,000 um, number soldiers that were with Harrison, and they didn't win. They were driven off, but Harrison goes on and he burns down the town. Uh, and when he did that, he found that the British had been supplying them with weapons, and so all the weapons that they had came from the British. And because they found weapons, right, in the possession of the Native Americans, it pushed America over the edge to war, right? And so after Tippecanoe, the Battle of Tippecanoe, the War of 1812 was declared against the British. But remember, and there was a whole list of reasons why the War of 1812 happened, impressment, right? Basically, British sailors going on to American ships and then uh, impressing sailors to work on British ships, right? There was a manpower shortage, and so they basically would kidnap or Shanghai sailors to work on British ships. So you had all of these things going on. Napoleon was at war in Europe, and you got the French and the British raiding American ships, etc. But the idea that they found weapons from the British in the hands of the Native Americans who were harassing and attacking Americans in America, well, that was it, right? And all of the war hawks, right? People who never saw a war they didn't like, led by Henry Clay, it pushed them over the edge and they said, okay, we got to go to war against England. And so we had the War of 1812. All right. And I thought this was really interesting. And I mentioned it to my seventh graders today that this is like Ukraine. All right. The US supplies nearly all of the weapons the Ukrainians are using to attack and kill Russians, right? Even the satellite imagery support to be able to launch missiles deep into Russia. I mean, that the Ukrainians don't have that technology, right? But the Americans are supplying it to them, the Americans and the British. And so, what's Russia supposed to do? They were supposed to declare war on the United States, much like in the way that the United States, when they discovered weapons that were being supplied from England in the hands of Native Americans, the US then says, oh, we got to go to war, you see. And so, in today's world, that's what Russia was supposed to do. Be like America and declare war on the United States. And I argue that it was probably intentional, right? So it wasn't like, I know a lot of people who say, we're not at war with Russia. Well, how dumb are you? Right? Imagine if Russia was supplying all these weapons and satellite imagery so that the Mexicans or the Canadians can attack cities in the United States, right? Can start launching drone attacks against Washington, D.C., right? And you're like, ooh, yeah, it's the Mexicans or it's the Canadians that are doing it, but it's the Russians that are making it possible. And so the United States, in a heartbeat, America would declare war against Russia. And so that's what the Russians were supposed to do. And I always thought that it was kind of interesting that Putin had so much amazing patience that he did not declare war against America. And I think he knew that that's what the plan was to do all these horrible things to Russians to goad and poke the Russian bear into having a war with the United States. So, in other words, this playbook, right, this strategy has been used in the United States since the beginning of the United States. And we probably have been using it all the time ever since, right? I even talked about a few episodes ago, we talked about the Panama Canal. And, Teddy Roosevelt, with the eighth graders, we were talking about the Panama Canal and how it was really suspicious, that chain of events. And clearly it was something that, the United States uses even today, right? That kind of, and you can go back and listen to that episode. But anyway, so the playbook of getting in the United States into war, it's pretty much written. And the government just pulls out the same plays over and over again, and people in America always fall for them, right? And so, because we know so little about history, and the history teachers that we had probably, like, I don't remember talking about any of this, were history teachers teach in such a way that most students will forget about all of this stuff. Well, now we're going to have a history that repeats or rhymes or whatever expression you want to use, right? And so as a result, bring it back to our original point. This is why we need free speech, even more than ever, uh, and why it is so important and so critical for us to understand this. And so, even if they are ideas we do not like, we must allow people to express them. Otherwise, we slip into hypocrisy, which, of course, as I always say, is the root of all injustice. And so, if you want to have an unjust society doing unjust things all over the world, then we must do away with the freedom of speech. But if we reject that road to perpetual war and oppression and injustice in the face of a coming banking crisis, then get rid of free speech. Hopefully, if you're listening to me, then you'll know and recognize why free speech is so important. And you'll make sure that the people around you realize just how important it is. I'm doing my best with my middle schoolers, so hopefully you guys are doing your part as well. I'll talk to you next time.